There's a version of gut health advice that says if you're over 50, it's too late. The damage is done. You manage it. You don't reverse it. I believed that for years. Then I got my Calprotectin tested. Came back under 5. That's essentially no gut inflammation. Not for a 25-year-old, for me, 53. After decades of medication, processed food, and a gut I'd genuinely written off. I'm Neil, 13 years of NHS blood tests, off all medication since February 2024. The same 3-month period that dropped my CRP inflammation marker by 84% also produced that Calprotectin result. Tim Spector's research, which I've been reading for a while, points to the same mechanism. The gut responds to inputs at any age. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what I changed, what the test said, and why I think the "it's too late" story is one of the most damaging things you can believe about your body when you're over 50. I'm not going to promise your gut will do what mine did. I don't know your starting point, and neither does anyone else who hasn't seen your blood tests. But I can show you what changed in mine across 3 months. The fermented foods, the plant diversity work, the specific markers that moved, and more importantly, the mechanism that explains why the gut responds faster than most people think it will. If you've been told something is wrong with your gut and you've been wondering whether it's actually fixable, the next 10 minutes might reframe that question for you. So let's start with the myth. And to be clear, it's not a stupid myth. It's not invented by people who want you to suffer. There's a version of it that makes complete sense. Here's how it goes. The gut microbiome is complex. It takes decades to build. By the time you're in your 50s, you've had antibiotics, processed food, stress medications, all of which affects the gut ecosystem. The NHS doesn't test for gut health markers routinely. There's no drug for microbiome diversity. So the clinical advice broadly is manage your symptoms. Take a probiotic if you want. Avoid the food that causes you trouble. Eat a bit more fibre. That's the guidance, and it's reasonable as far as it goes. Will Bulswick's gut doctor wrote a book I couldn't put down. He made a point that properly stopped me. He said food intolerances, in the vast majority of cases, aren't fixed by avoiding the trigger food. They're fixed by healing the gut microbiome that was struggling to handle it in the first place. Avoidance manages the symptoms. Feeding the gut addresses the cause. Here's the way I started to think about it. A highly diverse gut microbiome is like a well-tended garden in full bloom. Hundreds of different plants, rich soil, species supporting each other, barely any room for weeds because every patch is occupied by something useful. The ecosystem is self-reinforcing. A depleted microbiome is the opposite. The cracked council flower beds at the end of a dry August, a few tough weeds that can survive anything. Bare, compacted soil, nothing flowering, no resilience. It doesn't look dramatic from a distance. It just doesn't do much. That bit got me. The difference between these two states isn't genetic destiny. It's what you've been feeding the garden for the last 10 years. So let me show you what my before period actually looked like. And this is important because the before period here isn't just a few months, it's decades. From roughly my late 20s through to December 2023, I was eating what most people in the UK eat. Not dramatically badly by normal standards, but ultra-processed food was a regular part of it. Ready meals, supermarket bread, takeaways, snacks that come in packaging. The kind of diet that just happens when you're busy, running a business and not thinking about any of this. On top of that, gout medications for 24 years, alpurinol, 300 milligrams daily, statins for 11 years, asthma inhalers since 1978. These aren't trivial. And I want to be careful here because I'm not anti-medication, but certain medications over long periods can affect the gut environment. That's not conspiracy theory, that's pharmacology. Here's what my liver was telling me during that period, which I now think was partly a gut story. December 2023, ALT, that's alanine aminotransferase, a liver stress marker, sitting at 69. The upper limit of normal is 40. So I was nearly 173% of the upper limit. Not crisis levels, but elevated. Had been for years, on and off. Was I tracking gut health specifically? No, nobody had suggested it. Calprotectin, the gut inflammation marker, that later came back under 5. Wasn't on any NHS blood panel I'd had. I didn't even know it existed. That's part of the myth, isn't it? If you don't test for something, you assume it's either fine or unfixable. and I'd somehow managed to assume both simultaneously, which in retrospect doesn't even make sense. What I did know was bloating was just normal. Energy crashes were normal. The kind of digestive unpredictability you stop noticing because it's always been there. Not dramatic, just background noise that I'd learnt to ignore. Council flower beds getting by, not thriving. December 2023, Boxing Day specifically, that's when I decided something had to change. And over the following weeks, two things started shifting, roughly in parallel. The fasting piece. I've documented it quite extensively on here. Eating windows, non-UPF food, the whole approach. That started in earnest from January 2024. The gut-specific piece came a bit later, and honestly, more gradually than I tend to make it sound. Mid-2024, so about 6 months in, I started adding some very light fermented foods. Not dramatically. I bought a jar of kimchi from the supermarket, then some sauerkraut. Just tried them. Wasn't sure what I was expecting. And here's the thing that surprised me. They tasted far better than I thought they would. Particularly with salads, mixed into coleslaws, as a side with pretty much anything. It's genuinely not a sacrifice. It actually improves the meal. Then January 2025, I went further, made 20 of my own fermented food recipes, started using them regularly. And that's the period that overlaps with the blood test data that followed. Alongside that, plant diversity. I started tracking how many different plant types I was getting in my eating window. And this was the bit I wasn't expecting. You can hit 26, 28, 30 different plants in a 4 to 6 hour eating window if you plan it even slightly. Soups are brilliant for this. Herbs and spices count. A curry with a proper spice mix, you're adding 5 or 6 plants just in the seasoning. There was no dramatic moment, no single thing I stopped or started on a specific date. What happened was a gradual accumulation of inputs that 3 months later showed up in a blood test I wasn't especially watching for. January 2025, blood panel CRP, C-reactive protein, systemic inflammation marker sitting at 6.2. Technically within the normal range, but upper end. The kind of reading that doesn't trigger a letter, but shouldn't be celebrated either. April 2025, the same panel, CRP, 1. That's an 84% drop in 90 days. And on the same panel, Calprotectin, under 5 micrograms per gram. The reference range for gut inflammation essentially starts above that threshold. Mine was below it. Essentially, no measurable gut inflammation. I want to be honest about how I found this out. The letter said satisfactory. That was it. I wasn't sitting there watching for it in real time. I went back through the results later and properly read what had changed. Understanding came after the doing, not before it. What also changed? Alt, December 2023 at 69. By November 2025, it was 10. The lowest reading that I'd had in 13 years of blood tests. The statin years, when a drug is supposedly managing my cardiovascular risk, my liver was under stress the whole time. Off the statins, eating real food, adding fermented foods and plant diversity, liver came back to optimal. I wasn't tracking Alt as a gut story at the time. Looking at the numbers together now, it may well have been. Now, here's the mechanism that explains why I think this happened. And Will Bulsiewicz cites this from the American Gut Project, the largest citizen science microbiome study ever run. People eating 30 or more different plant types per week had significantly more diverse microbiomes than those eating 10 or fewer. That held regardless of dietary label, vegan, meat eater, anything in between. It wasn't the label. It was the diversity. The gut doesn't care what you call your diet. It asks one question. Did I get variety today or didn't I? And the way diversity works in the gut isn't by attacking what's already there. Think of it like a garden. You don't get rid of the weeds by going to war with them. You outcompete them. Feed the right things well enough and there's no room left for the rest. They don't disappear because you targeted them. They disappear because they've been crowded out. That's what plant diversity and fermented foods seem to do. You're not purging anything, you're planting ground cover. 30 plants, I was hitting that in a 4-hour eating window some days. Not through virtue, because I'd figured out that soups, salads and a decent spice rack made it almost accidental. 13 years of NHS blood tests, the actual numbers, the GP conversations, what changed and what didn't. If you want to follow someone who documents this properly rather than just talks about it, that's what this channel is. Subscribe if that's useful to you. So what does this actually mean? What the data suggests, in my case, one person, 13 years of blood tests, N equals 1. All the usual caveats. What this data seems to suggest is that the gut is more responsive to inputs than the manage it, don't reverse it framing implies. Calprotectin under 5 at 53 after decades of medication and a fairly standard UK diet wasn't something I'd expected to see. It suggests the gut was responding to what I was feeding it, fermented foods, plant diversity, fasting windows, not drugs, not supplements, food. That doesn't mean it will work for you, it means it worked in my case, and I'm documenting it honestly. I want to be clear, if you have diagnosed inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, or a serious gut condition with a clinical diagnosis, please don't take this video as a reason to step away from your gastroenterologist's advice. The data I'm describing is from someone without those diagnoses. The Calprotectin result ruled out serious gut inflammation. If yours comes back elevated, that's a conversation to have with your GP, not a YouTube video to implement around. The manage it advice exists for good reason in serious clinical situations. This video isn't speaking to those situations. Here's the bit I think matters most, and it's for people who haven't had a diagnosis yet. The mechanism that produced those results, feeding the gut diverse inputs, reducing inflammatory load, that process doesn't start the day you get a diagnosis. It's been developing or declining for years beforehand. The garden doesn't go from thriving to cracked flower beds overnight. It just quietly gets less interesting. If you're noticing things that feel off, digestion, energy, something that's hard to name and you haven't had any testing, the question worth raising with your GP isn't, what's wrong with me? It might be, can we look at some of these markers before something becomes a problem? Calprotectin isn't a standard NHS panel. CRP often isn't requested either, but both are available and both tell you something about what's happening now before a diagnosis, not after one. And I'll be honest, I should be doing more of this than I currently am. The fermented food habit I described January 2025, 20 recipes, using them regularly, I haven't kept it up as constantly as I should. The data in this video is real, but the habits that produced it aren't things I've nailed permanently. That's the actual challenge, not the knowledge, not even the taste, because they genuinely taste better than you'd expect. It's the consistency. It's worth saying, because if I only showed you the results without the honest reality of maintaining them, that wouldn't be a particularly useful video. If you're thinking about changing your diet significantly, especially if you're on medication, the conversation to have is with your GP, not instead of it. If this has made you curious about your own gut markers, CRP, Calprotectin, ALT, there's a link in the description to the 7-day fasting blueprint. It covers the food and eating windows approach that underpins most of what I've described today, and it's free. And remember, this is educational content, not medical advice. Your situation is not the same as mine. If you're on medication or if you have any diagnosed gut condition, please speak to your GP before changing your diet or your approach.